Welcome to the David Pakman Show mini-series on critical thinking. Critical thinking, generally speaking, is the analysis of issues in order to form judgments. That's really broad, but in the mini-series, we'll be going through the fundamentals of arguments, basic epistemology, logical fallacies, and other tools to further your critical thinking abilities. Why is critical thinking important? It's important because everyone thinks, and the quality of our thought affects what we produce, our personal well-being, our democracy, our entire world in limitless ways. And thinking that is distorted or incomplete can be costly. What is the result of critical thinking? Objectivity, reason, open-mindedness, effective communication, the raising of important questions, appropriate gathering and interpretation of information relevant to the questions we're trying to answer, and rational answers and conclusions, solutions to problems. Pieces of the critical thinking puzzle include clarity, elaboration, examples, illustrations, veracity, verification, observation, and testing, specificity, precision and details, relevance, how does that relate to the problem or question? How does that help us solve the problem or question? And logic, does this all make sense? This mini-series is an introduction to logic and other basic critical thinking concepts, things that unfortunately are not even taught in most American K-12 schools. We know many in our audience will already be familiar with some of these topics, but we have definitely created this in the hopes of reaching people who have not yet learned these concepts on a technical level. Please enjoy. We hear the words valid and validity used all the time, but I want to talk about what validity means in a technical sense with regard to something we've already discussed, deductive arguments. As a reminder, a deductive argument is an argument where the premises logically guarantee the conclusion. For example, if A is B and B is C, A must be C. There is no alternative. The concept of validity is a tool for evaluating the internal logic of a deductive argument. To say that an argument is valid is not the same as saying that the argument is good or sound. For example, imagine the premise that all dogs can fly and the second premise that Fido is a dog. The conclusion would be that Fido can fly. Although it might seem counterintuitive, this is a valid argument. An argument is valid if the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If it is true that all dogs can fly, then it must be true that Fido the dog can fly. But let's put this argument under more scrutiny. This is a valid argument, but it is not a sound argument. Soundness is an evaluation of both whether an argument is valid and whether its premises are true. A sound argument must be both valid and have true premises. Not all dogs can fly, so one of the premises is false, and our argument is not sound. So validity and soundness are properties of an argument, and truth is a property of a statement. Here's an argument that is sound because it is both valid and has true premises. All U.S. senators are politicians. Ted Cruz is a U.S. senator. The conclusion is that Ted Cruz is a politician. It's a horrible reality, but it is a reality and it is a sound argument. Here's an argument where the premises are true, but the argument is invalid, so the argument is not sound. Paris is a city. Germany is a country. Conclusion, Paris is the capital of Germany. It's not sound because that conclusion is not guaranteed by the truth of the premises. Or what about this one? Marco Rubio is a Republican, which is true. Hillary Clinton is a Democrat, which is true. And the conclusion is that Jill Stein is a member of the Green Party. In this particular case, both of the premises are true, and the conclusion happens to be true, but the two premises don't logically guarantee that conclusion. So the argument is invalid, and therefore it is not sound. We should only accept conclusions of arguments that are both valid and sound. Let's talk about arguments. It's usually the case that a conclusion, a claim, an assertion can't stand on its own. It needs something to hold it up, supporting it, and that's what we call an argument. An argument is a reason or a set of reasons that are meant to uphold a conclusion. An argument is your explanation of how you arrived at your conclusion. So an argument can be thought of as a set of statements that justify a new statement. The statements of your argument are called premises. Premise: the David Pakman Show studio is located in Boston. Premise: Boston is in Massachusetts. Conclusion: the David Pakman Show studio is in Massachusetts. This is an argument. This is also an example of a deductive argument. A deductive argument is an argument wherein the premises guarantee the conclusion. If our studio is located in Boston, and Boston is located in Massachusetts, our studio must be located in Massachusetts. It's a deductive argument because the premises expressed in the argument alone give you enough to deduce the conclusion. The conclusion that our studio is in Boston must follow the premises that are given. No new premises that could be added to this argument could change its validity. And given these two premises, this will always be the conclusion. But what if I said this? Premise: our channel has been releasing new YouTube videos every week for the last X years, however many it's been. Conclusion: our channel will have new episodes this week. Does my premise support my conclusion? Yeah, the premise gives me good reason to think that my conclusion is true, that the David Pakman Show will release new YouTube videos this week, but this is no longer a deductive argument. We would call this an ampliative argument, also known as an inductive argument. This is because my premise makes my conclusion probable, but the premise does not guarantee the conclusion. There are new potential premises that could invalidate the argument. For example, YouTube has been hacked by the Russians and the site has been taken offline for a month. So no, we're not going to be uploading new videos. So the premises of a deductive argument guarantee the conclusion no matter what other premises are added, and a strong inductive argument has premises that suggest that the conclusion is probably true, but other premises could be added that would invalidate the argument. If someone is intending their argument to be deductive, but their conclusion is not guaranteed by their premises, then you know it's a bad argument and not just ampliative. Deductive arguments are based on objectivity and inevitability. Ampliative arguments allow for more flexibility but require proper inference. Deductive arguments have the advantage of giving us everything we need to know simply within our premises, even if implicitly. It's concerned with testing and confirming a hypothesis. And this plays an important role in math and science, especially the hard sciences. But it's inductive reasoning and ampliative arguments that allow for creative thinking and consideration for what if. Think of practicing medicine and diagnosing a disease, or solving economic problems, or developing a marketing strategy. While inductive reasoning creates a risk for loss of objectivity, it pays off by making use of more open-ended thinking and problem-solving and consideration for outside factors and possibilities, which are crucial to countless fields. What is a claim? Trump is the greatest U.S. president in history. Berlin is the capital of Germany. The government should provide universal health care. I'm wearing white shoes. These are all claims. A claim is a statement, and claims assert something that could be true or it could be false. And often a claim is a statement that needs to be proven or supported, and this is done through the use of an argument, which also involves premises, evidence, and reasoning. But before even trying to determine whether a claim is true or false, it's important to know what kind of claim you're dealing with, because claims can fall under two categories: descriptive claims and normative claims. A descriptive claim says something about what is or what could be. Descriptive claims are objective, impartial, and don't involve value judgments. Such and such is the case. For instance, Fox News has a website. The trueness or falseness of this descriptive claim can be determined without invoking values. Go to foxnews.com, and there's the website. On the other hand, a normative claim makes an evaluation relative to something else, which means making a value judgment. For instance, Fox News is awful. This is a normative claim because it involves a value. This claim relates to standards of awfulness. The claim can't stand on its own without consideration for what it means for something to be awful. You can think of descriptive claims as asserting what is, and normative claims as asserting what ought to be. Let's look at some other descriptive claims. Tom only eats ice cream. Michael often doesn't stop at stop signs. Sarah is wearing a green shirt. These claims alone don't tell you anything about my perspective on these matters, whether or not I feel that these things are good or bad, or how I think these things might affect something else. But here are some normative claims about the same people. Tom should rethink his dietary habits. Michael is a bad driver. Sarah should dress differently before using a green screen. These claims use implicit inferences about how people ought to behave in reference to other values: good driving, good nutrition, and proper green screen attire. Let's take my claims about Sarah. My descriptive claim is Sarah is wearing a green shirt. This is objective and doesn't involve other values. But how do I know Sarah is wearing a green shirt? Because I can see her shirt and it's green. But take my normative claim, Sarah should dress differently before using a green screen. I'm making an assertion about what ought to be. I'm implicitly referencing other values that aren't present in my claim. The value of not blending in with the background, and the value of that being preferable for reasons that are based on other values, like making a good video, for example. Understanding all of this helps you understand how certain claims might need to interact with other claims. Not all claims can stand on their own without being inextricably linked to other ideas, values, and arguments that need to come into play. Wrapping your head around normative versus descriptive claims can help you recognize bias in yourself and in other people. It can also allow you to avoid trying to solve a problem merely by describing its parts, or, on the other hand, prescribing solutions to problems without properly describing what the problem is. And this is a fundamental concept in beginning to understand how different types of claims need different types of justifications. When we consider arguments in the bigger picture of having good reasons for our beliefs, sort of the core of critical thinking, we should understand when conditions are necessary or sufficient and how necessary and sufficient conditions might differ. Let's start with necessary conditions. Think of it this way. If A is necessary for B, then B cannot be true unless A is true. In other words, B is true only if A is true. A necessary condition for streaming a YouTube video is having an internet connection. You can only stream a YouTube video if you have an internet connection. A necessary condition for becoming president in the United States is being at least 35 years of age. You can only become president if you are at least 35 years old. The conclusion is only true if the necessary condition is true. You cannot have B without A. But sometimes a condition automatically establishes a certain conclusion, which is actually a different concept that we call a sufficient condition. If A is sufficient for B, then A being true by itself is enough to make B true. Or to put it another way, if A is true, then B is true. If A, then B. If you have access to YouTube, you can watch The David Pakman Show. If a U.S. presidential candidate wins 270 electoral votes, he or she has enough electoral votes to become president. A necessary condition for a conclusion is not always sufficient for that same conclusion, and vice versa. A sufficient condition for a conclusion is not always necessary. Here's an example of a condition that is necessary but not sufficient by itself. For someone to become a United States Supreme Court justice, it is necessary for them to be appointed by the president. But that's not sufficient. They must also be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Here's a condition that is sufficient but not necessary. Being born on U.S. soil is sufficient for status as a U.S. citizen, but it is not necessary. Many people, like me, are born in other countries and become naturalized U.S. citizens later in life. Some conditions are both necessary and sufficient for a conclusion. This would mean that the conclusion statement is true if and only if the condition is true. Being an unmarried male is both a necessary and sufficient condition for being a bachelor, for example. You can't visit the capital of California unless you go to Sacramento. You can't win a U.S. presidential election with 538 electoral votes unless you win all of every state's electoral votes. Having 538 votes requires winning all electoral votes in every state. So winning all of every state is a necessary condition, and winning all the electoral votes in every state automatically establishes that you have won 538 electoral votes. So it's also a sufficient condition. There's nothing else you must do in order to win 538 electoral votes. In science, a necessary and sufficient event is considered a cause, and the resulting event is considered the effect. Some conditions are neither necessary nor sufficient for the conclusion. Being a lawyer is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a politician. Many politicians are not lawyers, and being a lawyer does not ensure that you will be a politician. So it's important to be able to discern when these are being misused, when a sufficient condition is being mistaken for a necessary condition, or vice versa. Understanding the difference between these types of conditions and their applications to arguments is another fundamental skill in recognizing good and bad arguments in yourself and in others. Often when someone makes an argument and comes to a conclusion, they don't always come out and explicitly state all of their premises. Some of the premises that are needed to get us to the conclusion are left out and assumed to be true. Here's an example. Premise: Barack Obama served 2 terms as president. Conclusion: at the end of Obama's second term, he was not eligible for re-election in 2016. But to get from that premise to this conclusion, we actually need another premise, which is that the law prohibits presidents from serving more than 2 terms. Because this premise wasn't explicitly presented in the argument, this is what we would call a suppressed premise or an implicit premise. And sometimes having suppressed premises is okay, and it's more common than you might think. It's fine to leave a premise suppressed if it fits both of the following 2 criteria. If the premise is universally accepted, and if it's knowledge that the person or people you're speaking to already have. In my argument about Barack Obama, it would be okay to leave out the premise about presidents being bound legally to 2 terms if the person who I'm speaking to already knows that this premise is true. But here's another argument. Premise: we want fewer people to die from drug addiction. Conclusion: the war on drugs should continue. The suppressed or implicit premise here is that the war on drugs reduces deaths caused by drug addiction. Whether or not this premise is true, it's controversial, and it cannot be assumed that this premise is obvious to the person listening to the argument. And that's why it's important for us to recognize when premises may be implicit in an argument when the argument is presented. If a controversial or questionable premise is being implied, the person making the argument may have a responsibility to justify that claim as well. Implicit premises can create fallacies just as easily as stated premises. The straw man fallacy is committed when you take someone's argument and replace it with a different argument that is an exaggerated, distorted, or an otherwise misrepresented version of that person's argument, usually because you find it easier to refute. This is sometimes done by accident, but it's also often done intentionally as a pretense of refuting the original argument. Here's an example. Two political candidates are debating. Candidate X says the government is spending too much on the military. Other government services are underfunded. We do not need to add to the military's budget. Candidate Y responds by saying, "This is unbelievable. My opponent wants to leave America defenseless." The response by candidate Y is a straw man. Candidate Y is misrepresenting the argument made by candidate X. Candidate X's conclusion was that we do not need to add to the military budget. Candidate Y is implying that candidate X's argument was America should be left defenseless. These two arguments are very different, and the argument that candidate Y is portraying is much easier to refute, which could be why candidate Y used a straw man as an attempt to plant in the mind of voters that this is what candidate X was actually arguing for. Let's look at why the straw man fallacy is fallacious in a technical sense. Here's a breakdown of a straw man. Person 1 argues A. Then person 2 argues the following, that person 1 is arguing B, that B is false, and thus person 1 is wrong about A. The argument made by person 2 is invalid. The trueness or falseness of B has no bearing on the trueness of A. Straw man arguments can be made by oversimplifying an opponent's argument as well in order to, for example, make it seem naive and thus easier to refute. Or a straw man can occur when you make your opponent's statement seem more extreme than it actually is. Look at this list. These are statements that could be made about something. Statements closer to the outside are more extreme and harder to defend and easier to attack. Statements closer to the middle are less extreme and easier to defend and more difficult to attack. It's common for someone to strawman by taking their opponent's statement, which in reality is closer to the middle, and misrepresenting the argument to make it seem closer to the outside, which makes it easier to attack. Strawmanning is essentially putting words in someone's mouth. It can be one of the most intellectually dishonest but powerful and deceptive logical fallacies, which is why it is so important to consciously avoid doing this and to recognize and point out when it's being done to you. Think about how many conclusions people have come to throughout history that have eventually been proven false, despite a majority of society agreeing with the conclusions at the time they were made. This brings us to our next fallacy, appeal to the people, or as it's also known in Latin, argumentum ad populum. This is an argument that concludes that something is true or false because many or most people believe that the conclusion is true or false. This fallacy is also known as the bandwagon fallacy, an appeal to the masses, or the consensus fallacy. Do we know that Christianity is true because it has more adherents in the world than any other religion? Do we know that a political candidate was the best choice in an election because they won the popular vote? Do we know that a musician has talent because their album sales are through the roof? The premise is most of society believes X. Conclusion, X is true. If this is meant to be a deductive argument, this argument is invalid because the premise is irrelevant to the conclusion. Something can be true even if many or most people believe it to be false, and vice versa. The same thing would apply to a deductive argument like this one. Most people do X, therefore X is the best way to achieve Y. As a deductive argument, the conclusion does not follow. But an appeal to the people can sometimes be valid in an inductive argument. For example, if a poll with a large population size is taken in a certain city, and the poll finds that 99.7% of people want their city council to take a certain measure on a certain issue, you could use that premise as an evidence to inductively argue that the next person from that area to be asked the same question will probably side with the majority. Here, what most people believe actually does have bearing on the trueness of the conclusion. But for instance, it would be fallacious to use that as proof deductively that what those 99.7% of people want their city council to do is the right thing to do, or that it will accomplish what they're aiming for. There are multiple approaches to appealing to the people. The bandwagon approach, hey, everyone is doing it, and what is sometimes called the snob approach, hey, all the best people are doing it, and the patriotic or tribalistic approach. Everyone is doing it who is a part of the group that you are a part of, or should be a part of, or want to be a part of. The appeal to the people fallacy is used all the time in advertising. Another example, employees of corporations often try to absolve themselves in criminal proceedings by saying, everyone in our industry does this. It should be obvious that not every idea or practice or opinion has merit by mere virtue of its popularity. But the appeal to the people fallacy is an important one to recognize because of how often and carelessly it's committed.